Welcome to Let the Quran Speak. My name is Sophia, I'm your host. The aim of Let the Quran Speak is to help you gain deeper insights into Muslims and Islam as it's practiced here and in other parts of the world. Did Muslims invent Muhammad? That's the subject of a book by Robert Spencer entitled Did Muhammad Exist? An inquiry into Islam's obscure origins. Spencer claims Muhammad was a myth, a political invention created much later to serve the needs of an expanding empire. Are his claims true? Here to assess them, Dr. Shabir Ally, president of the Islamic Information Center. Brother Shabir, what does it mean if Spencer's claims are true? Does this call into question the basis of Islam and Islamic belief?
Yes, of course, in a very big way. If the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, did not exist, then there's no reason to be a Muslim.
Mm-hmm.
And in fact, the Quran would be one of the most massive fakes in all of history in terms of literature. But of course, his claim is not true.
All right, explain that. Why is it untrue?
Well, first of all, we should, every Muslim knows that Muhammad existed, and it's common knowledge that there was a man named Muhammad who was the founder of the Islamic religion, even among non-Muslims. So we should now be asking the reverse question: why does this man think that Muhammad did not exist and that Muslims invented him?
Mm-hmm. And are there other people who think that? Because he claims to be building on scholarly sources that exist. So what is he referring
yes.
to?
In every field of inquiry, there is a mainstream scholarship, and then there is fringe scholarship. Mm-hmm. Mainstream scholarship on Islam would include Muslim mainstream scholarship, but it will also include non-Muslim mainstream scholarship. So in other words, among Orientalists, Europeans who have studied the religions of the East and cultures and civilizations of the East, you have a stream of academic scholars who have been studying Islam for a couple of hundred years now. And they have developed a sort of consensus, an idea about how Islam originated and developed and eventually reached the stage that we know now to be Islam. And they generally say that the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, did exist. He was a historical person, but that Muslims made more of him than he actually was. And they invented things, put things in his mouth and so on in terms of the hadith collections. But when it comes to the Quran, a certain scholar, Theodore Noldeck, from more than 100 years ago, described the collection of the Quran in the time of Uthman, the third caliph of Islam, as basically authentic. And that many different readings of the Quran are known, and they all go back to that core book, which was promulgated in the time of the third caliph Uthman. And this was within 2 decades after the death of the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him. So the Quran is authentic, though not all hadiths are authentic. So the hadith collections would have.
So the Quran isn't something that was invented later on. It was something that is actually from the time that Muslims claim it to be.
Exactly.
Okay.
So now, so that's mainstream scholarship.
Mm-hmm.
In this case, there is a confluence of Muslim and non-Muslim scholarship. The difference is that Muslim scholarship would insist that the Quran was collected not only in the time of Uthman, but even before that, during the caliphate of Abu Bakr, and that Uthman just simply made copies and sent them out to various parts of the Muslim empire. Nevertheless, even if the European consensus is correct, that the Quran that we have now goes back to the Caliph Uthman, to Muslims this is still dependable because now we have a book which was put into writing by the companions of the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, because within 2 decades of his death, we have not only Uthman, who was a companion, but Zayd, who is said to have headed the commission to collect the pieces and put them together as the Quran. He's a companion of the Prophet, and this was done in the presence of many, many other known and respectable companions of the Prophet, peace be upon him. So it would be like the equivalent of saying we have a book which was put together by the remaining 11 disciples of Jesus and add Matthias to make it 12. Mm-hmm. So these 12 disciples put together this document, so we know that these are the teachings of Jesus, because the disciples wouldn't lie. They're telling us firsthand what they saw Jesus say and do. Mm-hmm. So if we have in the Islamic context now something similar, which now the European scholars say we have, a book which was composed by companions of the Prophet, peace be upon him, within that early period, then, and they themselves also being careful not to record what they thought and what they would like to write, but to just simply recollect what the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, taught them, and to put them in this book, and this is the book of God, well then to Muslims this is quite dependable. And that's the mainstream scholarship.
So you've mentioned Jesus, and the question is, how does the historical record about Muhammad, about the Quran and Islam, because they're all related, how does that relate to the historical record of other religious figures perhaps, or of other historical important events?
Well, if we think of the Prophet Jesus, then let's think about what Robert Spencer himself describes. He talks about the historical inquiry into the life of Jesus and so on, and he's asking, well, why couldn't we make the same kind of inquiry about the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him? And he's right. Well, why should the Prophet Muhammad be excluded from this kind of historical inquiry? We should investigate everybody, the Siddhartha Gautama Buddha, Jesus, Muhammad, Krishna, anyone who is taken to be a revered or a holy figure or an important person to be emulated and followed. Our historical curiosity should take us there. We want to find out who were these persons before somebody made them into a myth or into a hero. So the inquiry, the inquiring, to have an inquiring mind is a good thing. But that doesn't mean that the results of all inquiry are beneficial or dependable. Sometimes people take their research in directions, sometimes they're motivated by personal interest, which takes them beyond the confines of academic disinterest and neutrality and objectivity. And this is what I think has happened in the case of Robert Spencer. So in any case...
So the question is what we know of Muhammad dependable compared to what we know of other historical figures?
Yes, much more dependable. And he himself in his book admits that the Gospels that we have of Jesus were compiled within 40 to 60 years after the crucifixion. So that means in the late decades of the first century. And you say 40 years for the first and earliest of the four Gospels, that means that for 40 years the Christian community did not have these written documents. So how did they think about Jesus? How did they recollect his words? How did they preach about him? And then Christian scholars generally say that the Gospels as they now are written recollect not only what Jesus said, but how he was being preached about within that 40-year gap. So by comparison, the companions of the Prophet, peace be upon him, giving us the Quran from the time of Uthman, are giving us not the preaching of the community, but the precise words which they memorized and wrote down from the time of the Prophet, peace be upon him. So that's very different, because we do not have on record that anyone went about in the early decades of the first century memorizing the actual words of Jesus. And this is why we have so often the same words represented in different ways in the four Gospels, because people captured the gist of what he said without memorizing the precise words. So then, why does he think that the Prophet Muhammad is invented? I think this is the most important question.
Yeah, and he points to like biographical information and says that it came 125 years after Muhammad's death. He points to some coinage, inscriptions, things like that don't reference Muhammad. So maybe you can comment on some of those things.
So I started referring to the fringe scholarship. In arguing the matter in that way, he is pursuing lines of argument presented by a fringe scholarship. And more than this, actually he is putting together a mishmash of ideas that came from various scholars who each in their own way is on a fringe. And some of these ideas, in fact, were abandoned by some of the protagonists who first put out these ideas, and he's still citing them as the authorities behind who stand behind these ideas. Let me give an example. For example, he would say that there is no mention of the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, on the early coins which were minted in the Umayyad dynasty. Well, that's true. But what is the reason for this absence of the mention of the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him? Well, a certain scholar writing in the collection by Angela Neuwart and others entitled The Quran in Context Heidemann. Heidemann writes about these coins that the early Umayyad caliphs did not find it necessary to produce their own coins. They were just simply using coins that were already available from the Roman Empire. And though they established their own Islamic state, they didn't see that it was necessary to have an empire, an Islamic empire that mints its own coins. And later on, when they will try to mint their own coins, they found from experience that they minted a gold coin, for example, and because it did not bear a cross, it could not become popular among Christians. And they wanted the coins which were already in use and which were already popular. There was no need to change them. So what these fringe scholars are saying now is that look at these coins. They are more like Christian coins than Muslim coins. And that means that Islam as a religion did not really quite exist. And maybe Muslims were a sort of Christian at this time, and Islam would really come later. And when they come up with the idea of Islam, then they would invent its founder, the Prophet Muhammad. But this kind of conspiracy theory requires first rejecting the Islamic evidence and start with a blank slate, and then just coming up with some ideas based on some clues here and there. But we cannot do history like this. You mentioned the biography. Yes, it is true that biographies of the Prophet, peace be upon him, were written some 125 years after the death of the Prophet, peace be upon him. The earliest one we know now, or we have in our hands, is that by Ibn Ishaq, as edited by Ibn Hisham later. But there were also biographies written earlier, at least some compilation of information regarding some of his expeditions, the Prophet, peace be upon him's expeditions, such as by Musa ibn Uqba. And some scholars have done some detailed studies on this recently, such as Gregor Scholler, and they have shown that, in fact, there is some reliable information within the biography. So you cannot just simply throw out all of the biographies. It is true that the biographies contain some later myths and legends and so on as well, which you have to be wary of. But that does not mean that you throw out the baby with the bathwater and you don't take any of the core information. William Montgomery Watt as well has argued along similar lines and showed that, in fact, there must have been some dependable information. When, for example, a battle has been fought and there are slain soldiers, and there are family members now celebrating that we are the descendants of those slain soldiers, and there are many such persons. Now, you cannot discount all of them. There could be some false claimants, but the basic idea that there are fallen soldiers and we are the descendants, that is the basic historical fact. And many other scholars, like Michael Lecker, for example, in the Cambridge Companion to Muhammad, writes that there is a historical core which we can definitely decipher. Robert Spencer also relies on Michael Cook and Patricia Crone. But Patricia Crone and Michael Cook, though advancing some of these ideas in their book Hagerism, in which they first threw out all of the material from Islamic sources and they went with information that they can glean from other such circumstantial evidence like coins and so on, they first advanced this idea that Islam came later and the Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, was invented in retrospect. But they have since then rejected the very idea. And now it is very strange that Robert Spencer are referring to these as the scholars who stand behind this idea. They no longer stand behind this idea. They have discounted this idea.
So to conclude then, Muhammad did exist?
Yes.
And according to many?
According to Muslim scholars and according to the consensus of non-Muslim Orientalist academic scholars.
All right, thank you for that, Brother Shabir.
You're welcome.
We'll take a break. When we return, we will look at the question of martyrdom.